the average southeastern property that you go on, if you just took a random sample of 5 out of 100, they're probably going to have too much cover. And it makes it really hard to isolate movements when you have too much cover. And so I oftentimes, when I work with landowners on management plans, we will intentionally open things up more.
And this is super relevant for really anybody in the entire Southeast. How do you key in on bucks, maybe specifically, in areas where cover and food seem to be just completely abundant? Cover and food is everywhere.
Yeah.
Pine plantation, perfect
Like
example.
select cut pines or something like that, mix of clear cuts and different age. Yeah.
Yeah, because selfishly, I just joined a club that's like that. It's got every kind of pine you could ever want on it. Very, very few hardwoods. There's little tiny SMCs, but even the SMCs have loblollies like this big around in them.
Yeah.
And everything else is, young pines, long leaves that they burn, thin pines that are woody underneath, thin pines that are ferns and grasses underneath, like anything you can imagine. So it's whenever you look around, you're like, food cover, like everywhere.
Mm-hmm. My answer to that would be management. Because I work with landowners in that exact scenario, and in even the opposite scenario. Like the average southeastern property that you go on, if you just took a random sample of 5 out of 100, they're probably going to have too much cover. And it makes it really hard to isolate movements when you have too much cover. And so I oftentimes, when I work with landowners on management plans, we will intentionally open things up more. And that's not only to increase, it's particularly growing season forage quality for deer, because that's oftentimes a limiting factor. Even when there's food plots, they're still going to eat lots of native plants. And we can, increase the nutritional carrying capacity of our woods by 4, 5, 6 times by implementing certain practices. But in addition to that is to make them huntable. And we want specifically, and this speaks back to what we were talking about earlier with the South Carolina data, we want specifically to know or to have a pretty good idea of where these deer are going to feed and where these deer are going to rest and what, they're using as cover. And so that pattern just became so evident to me in that South Carolina data set, where you have bucks returning from feeding to cover in the morning and then from cover back to feeding in the evening, that drives more of my deer hunting decisions than anything else. Like that's what I'm thinking about anytime I go hunt a new property or I go hunt a new place on a property. I think about, and deer will bed anywhere sometimes, right? Like it's not a perfect predictor, but you can start to, if a property doesn't have that situation where cover is ubiquitous, you can start to pick apart and have a pretty good idea that deer are going to come from this general area and go to this general area, and I need to be in the way to intercept them. And so, in those situations, when you start really getting that pattern nailed down, and this may be further than you wanted to go on this particular topic, so feel free to rein me in if you want, but when you start to get that pattern really nailed down on a particular property, you can even start to introduce a food source between their bedding cover and their destination where they ultimately want to end up, so that you can encounter that deer while it's still daylight. Or you can encounter that deer, after the sun has come up, if on a morning hunt. So you can strategically start to move those pieces around of the puzzle. But like you said, most properties, they're not actively managing the forest. They're not implementing prescribed fire. So cover is so ubiquitous that it's almost impossible to try to tease that out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, in that same situation, again, let's just talk the average southeastern property, a lot of pines most of the time. Outside of, and this might be kind of hard to answer, but I have to ask it. Outside of like a high-quality food plot or a big giant oak flat, is there any way to discern what a destination food source would be in a situation like that? I mean, I guess you're talking at this point native browse.
Yeah. Yeah, that's hard because oftentimes it is so spread out. Like, I mean, if you have like a relatively small pine stand, you may have relatively even availability of forage throughout that pine stand. So, I would look for in that situation, if there's, a lot of sign that deer are using that area to forage, look for the forage that's adjacent to cover. because you oftentimes won't see deer get too far from cover. And that's another, that also has management relevance too, right? So you generally want to avoid creating a scenario like what I described on that South Carolina property, and they're not managing specifically for this reason, so I'm not knocking their management. They have other objectives that they're trying to satisfy, but you don't want endless acres of pine savanna, because ultimately the middle of that becomes relatively low use by deer. So you're not getting much bang for your buck out of having that acreage there, because they just never go into it. They don't feel comfortable enough if the cover is, only halfway up your shin and it's a 50-acre stand. The only time they're going to be in the middle of that is night, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where I start thinking about the scale of my management.
I gotcha. Okay. Now, one thing, when that listener wrote in the question the other day, we didn't put this on the episode because I didn't think about it till after the fact, which usually happens. It
know
was,
how that is.
Like when you have that much cover and that much food, then the next factor down the line that could affect where they're hanging out would be hunting pressure, correct? Mm-hmm. And so specifically with this study, I'm curious about your thoughts on that. If you have a lot of food and a lot of cover and that's just your situation, then the next thing down the line that you'd be looking at is hunting pressure. Does that kind of track with where your head is with it?
Yeah, I think so. And it's important to keep in mind. I'm glad you brought this up, because I should have brought it up earlier. But hunting pressure can override all of that, right? So you can have the best food plot, the best natural food source. Of course, hunting pressure can override that. There's a reason that deer don't just stand out in the most high energy or high protein food source all during the day, because they would die, right? They'd get killed, whether it's by us or whether it's by a predator. So hunting pressure definitely factors into that, and you have to be cognizant of it. And I've even heard a lot of people talk about hunting deer over bait. And is that an effective strategy? Like, what are the actual harvest rates over bait? Does it help or does it hinder? And then you take that even a step further and people start talking about, well, you're never going to kill a mature buck over bait. Well, all bait is, regardless of your thoughts on it or whatever you think about the ethics of it, is just a concentrated, highly preferred food source. And so it's going to have that same interaction with hunting pressure as anything else is. And you can effectively kill mature bucks over a corn pile. Like, it is absolutely possible. But how do most people hunt a corn pile? Right? They sit in the same areas time after time. They may or may not be probably paying attention to the wind direction relative to where the deer are approaching from, or even relative to the direction of the corn pile. So if you hunt them that way, no, it's not going to be very productive. But yeah, if you manage your pressure, it is possible to attract deer during daylight hours to that food source too.